On July 25, 1984, a 35-year-old woman named Zhao Xiaolian stood in her doorway talking to an agitated man in Liaoyuan City in northeastern China. The man was a friend of Zhao's husband, Li, and he kept pacing back and forth, and he was loud and very animated when he spoke. Zhao glanced over her shoulder and saw her 7-year-old daughter drawing a picture at a small table in the front room, and Zhao turned and asked her husband's friend to please keep his voice down. The man nodded and then did lower his voice, and then told Zhao everything was going to be okay. By the end of the night, she wouldn't have to worry or keep the secret she was hiding anymore. She just needed to follow the instructions he had given her. The man then said goodbye and wished her luck. Zhao closed the door and just stood there in silence for a second. Then she forced a smile onto her face and turned and walked over to her daughter. Zhao was about 5'3" tall, with black hair and dark brown eyes, and her daughter looked a lot like her. Zhao told her daughter she could finish her drawing later, because for now, she was going to go stay with her uncle for a while. And right away, Zhao's daughter's face lit up and she ran to the door. Zhao followed her and slipped on her favorite pair of shoes. They were red sandals with a low heel. Then she took her daughter's hand and they both walked outside. The pair made their way through the neighborhood that lay on the outskirts of the city, not far from the surrounding mountains. The streets were lined with small gray wooden houses, and Zhao basically knew everybody who lived in these houses. This was a neighborhood where multiple generations of families had grown up right alongside each other. Usually, that was something Zhao loved about this place, that sense of community. But now, all she could imagine were her neighbors staring out at her from their windows, trying to figure out the secret that she was hiding from everyone. After walking for a few more minutes, Zhao's daughter let go of her mother's hand and ran down the street to her uncle's house and then knocked on the door. As this happened, Zhao prayed her brother was actually home. In 1984, nobody where Zhao lived had a car. In fact, even bicycles were seen as a luxury. If people needed to travel for work, they could catch a bus or a train from the city center, but typically, they just walked everywhere. The people in this area at the time also did not have telephones, so if they wanted to get in touch with somebody out of town, they wrote letters. And if they needed to talk to someone close by, they simply walked over to their house to see them. So it was not uncommon to show up at somebody's house unannounced and to find that nobody was home. But luckily, Zhao saw her brother open up his door and he hugged Zhao's daughter, and as this happened, Zhao felt like a huge weight had been lifted. She got to the house, and before her brother could say anything, she told him that she needed him to watch her daughter, while she walked to the clinic in town to see a doctor. He said of course, he'd love to watch his niece, but he asked Zhao was she okay? Zhao said it was no big deal, she just had a little stomach ache and wanted to get some medicine for it. Zhao then thanked her brother, hugged her daughter tight, and said she loved her. Once her brother closed the door behind them, Zhao turned and started walking. But she did not head to the clinic. Instead, she rushed back home. When Zhao got there, she immediately walked to the back of her house and found her bicycle leaning up against a wall on the small back patio. Zhao's husband, Li, had a good job at a supply company, and Zhao had a well-paying job at a government textile factory. So together, as a two-income family, they were able to afford certain things, like bicycles, that many of their neighbors could not. Zhao rolled the bike to the street in front of her house. She saw the sun beginning to disappear behind the mountains, and she knew it was going to be dark soon. So she put her red sandals on the pedals and rode off as fast as she could. The following day, around noontime, an old farmer wiped the sweat dripping down his forehead. He'd spent hours doing back-breaking work, and he needed a rest. He walked south and could hear the running water of the Weijin River nearby. The farmer made his way to the edge of his land, and the river came into view. But suddenly, the farmer stopped. Part of the riverbank, about 10 feet from the water, was overgrown with trees and bushes. But through the weeds, the farmer saw something strange laying near one of the trees. He tried to block the sunlight to get a better view, but he still couldn't quite tell what he was looking at. He walked closer and stared at the ground right near the tree, and suddenly a look of pure horror crossed his face. He took off running across a shallow part of the river and headed toward the city center that was over 12 miles away. He left the river and farmland behind, running faster than he had in years. And he kept on running for the entire 12 miles, until he got to the city center and arrived at the local police station. The farmer walked through the door and tried to catch his breath, and as he did, 2 officers quickly walked over to him and asked what was wrong. He told them they needed to come with him to the river right away, but the officers told the farmer to just rest for a minute and explain what was going on here. However, the story the farmer told them was so shocking, they thought the old man must be confused. But the farmer insisted he knew what he was talking about and begged them to follow him. So eventually, the officers called over a few other cops and told the farmer to lead the way. The farmer, still exhausted from his run, led the police out of the station, and then they all walked 12 miles back to the river. When they finally got there, the 2 officers followed the farmer to a tree on the riverbank, and right away they could see the old man had been telling the truth. But they still didn't want to believe what their eyes were seeing, because laying on the ground, the officers saw a naked, charred corpse. They could tell it was a woman who was maybe a little over 5 feet tall, and she had severe burns all over her body. The burns were so bad that it was impossible to make out her facial features, let alone see any identifying marks. The officers tried to stay calm, but they had never seen anything like this before. They spent most of their shifts breaking up fights in town or occasionally investigating robberies. That was it. The 2 officers walked away from the body and joined the other cops, who also had no experience in a case like this. But they did know they had to search the area for potential clues. So they split into teams, with one group searching the riverbank and the other searching the nearby farmland. On the riverbank, about 20 feet from the body, something caught one of the cops' attention. It was a woman's burned blouse and pants and a pair of red sandals. Just then, another officer called out, and the cop staring at the clothes and the sandals snapped to attention. Then he joined the other group and saw them looking at a single set of footprints on the riverbank, and it didn't take them long to match those prints to the red sandals. The police continued to search the area, but they didn't find anything else that stood out. And since they had a body and only one pair of footprints that matched the red sandals they'd found, they thought they'd figured it out. This woman had come to the river alone, set herself on fire on the riverbank, and taken her own life. The following day, July 27th, a detective named Soon Eugene sat at the back of a small, brightly lit meeting room at the local police station. Detective Soon was in his early 30s and had black hair and dark eyes. He listened to a group of officers talking to the police chief about the autopsy report they had received for the body they discovered by the river. Soon had not been a part of the group at the river, but he needed to speak to the chief, so he sat there and waited. The officer said that the autopsy report did not identify the woman, but it gave a pretty clear picture of how she died. The body had not been burned after death. She had black carbon foam in her lungs and blood vessels, and that indicated she had been breathing while she was burning. This meant the fire and related smoke inhalation had killed her, and so these officers were saying they felt like that confirmed their theory, that this woman had basically lit herself on fire to commit suicide. And at this, Detective Soon, who had been quiet to this point, sat up in his chair and shouted, "I disagree." The officers immediately turned and just glared at him. Some people in town said Detective Soon was smarter than everybody else, but a few of his colleagues thought he was just plain arrogant. One of the officers pointed out that Soon had not been at the river, so he couldn't possibly know what had happened. But the police chief chimed in and asked Soon why he disagreed. Soon nodded and walked to the front of the room. Then, with the captive audience in front of him, he said, first, self-immolation, setting yourself on fire, was a rare way for somebody to kill themselves. And often when self-immolation occurred, the person doing it was doing it to make a political statement of some kind. And so Soon did not think this woman, who was found in the middle of nowhere and didn't leave a message behind, was making some sort of statement. Before the other officers could argue, Soon said there was actually an easier way to prove this woman didn't kill herself. He said the officers had searched the entire area near the river, but they hadn't found a gas can or any other container that could have held the fuel that burned her. So either this woman doused herself in gasoline and then walked for miles before lighting herself on fire, or, and Soon said this was way more likely, someone else doused her in some sort of fuel, murdered her by setting her on fire, and then ran off with the gas can. The officers just stared at Soon. Even if he was arrogant, most of them admitted he had made a good point. But an officer asked him, well, okay, if somebody else killed her, why was there only one set of footprints? which appeared to be the dead woman's footprints. Detective Soon said that was a great question, and they would need to look into that. But it was hardly a reason to chalk this whole thing up to suicide. Soon told the police chief he was sure they had a murder case on their hands, and he knew he could solve it. And the chief didn't hesitate. He said okay, they would treat the woman found at the river as a homicide victim, and Detective Soon would lead the investigation. Later that day, Soon walked to the river with several other officers. He held a file folder of photographs that had been taken at the scene the day before. Soon knew that some of his colleagues wished he had kept his mouth shut. It would have been a lot easier if they deemed this a suicide, closed the case, and simply moved on. But Soon was sure he had made the right call. He refused to believe that a woman could just set herself on fire and not leave any trace of how she'd done it or why. And when Soon stared down at the footprints that were still on the riverbank, he knew he was right. He crouched down and took out a photograph of the red sandals the police had found there the day before. He glanced between the footprints and the photo, and he knew the officers had been right. The prints matched the sandals. But Soon caught something else the others had missed. He gently pressed his hand down into the ground not far from the footprints, and he was able to make a handprint. However, the ground was so wet that the moment he removed his hand, that print quickly vanished. It was like the ground kind of ate it back up, like water had washed it away. Soon looked at the photo again and fixated on the heels of the red sandals. They weren't high heels, but they were thick and solid, definitely heavy enough to leave a deeper footprint, whereas a lighter, flatter shoe might not have left a mark at all, and they would have just vanished like his handprint. Soon still did not have a clear picture of what had happened here, but he knew things would become a whole lot clearer as soon as he identified the victim, the dead woman who had worn those red sandals. The following morning, Detective Soon was sitting at his desk studying the crime scene photos when he heard somebody call his name. Soon looked up and saw an officer standing next to a man who looked like he had not slept in a long time. Soon asked if this man needed his help, and the man told him he was really worried. His older sister, Zhao, had been missing for days. Soon looked around and saw there was an empty office in the corner, so he scooped up the file folder with the crime scene photos inside and then led Zhao's brother into the office and closed the door behind them. Once they sat down at the small table inside the office, Soon asked the man when was the last time he had seen his sister. He said Zhao had dropped off his niece a couple of days ago before going to the clinic, but she never came back. So he'd brought his niece to his other sister's house and then spent a whole day walking everywhere and talking to everyone to see if they had heard from Zhao, but nobody had. Soon looked at the man with pity in his eyes. The man was already so upset, and Soon hated that he was about to cause him a whole lot more pain. Soon opened the file folder and pulled out photos of the woman's blouse and the red sandals that had been found at the river. He asked Zhao's brother if he recognized the clothing. Zhao's brother stared at the photos and started shaking his head like he didn't want to accept what he was seeing. But eventually, he looked up and said yes, those are definitely Zhao's clothes. Soon told the man he was very sorry to say this, but they had recently found his sister's body near the river, and he believed someone had murdered her. Zhao's brother immediately broke down sobbing. Soon gave the man a couple of minutes to compose himself, and then he apologized for pressing him at a time like this, but he wanted to know why Zhao's husband had not already reported his wife missing. Zhao's brother wiped the tears away from his face. Then he said that Zhao's husband, Li, was on a business trip hours away, so he wouldn't have had any idea about what was going on. Detective Soon promised he would find whoever had done this, and then he asked Zhao's brother to please not speak publicly about his sister's death. Soon believed holding back information could be crucial in identifying the killer. Zhao's brother nodded and said that he and his other sister would not say a word. Later that day, Detective Soon walked through Zhao's house to her and her husband's bedroom. Now, this was not a crime scene, but Soon hoped something there might point him in the right direction. He searched the dresser and bedside tables, but didn't find anything that stood out. He crossed the room and opened up the drawer of a wooden desk that was pressed against the wall. Inside, he found playing cards, photos, and a blue hardcover notebook. He opened up the notebook and looked at the first page, and quickly realized this was Zhao's diary. Sun flipped through the diary and found the last entry. It was dated just a few days before her death. He read the entry, and it really took him by surprise, because basically it was one complaint after another about her husband, Lee. And all these complaints basically boiled down to the same thing. Zhao clearly believed that Lee cared more about money than about his family. Detective Sun bagged the diary as evidence. Now he just needed to track down Zhao's husband. A few hours later, Detective Sun and members of his team met with Lee's boss at the supply company where he worked. And Sun got right to the point and said the police needed to find Lee right away. They knew he was traveling for business, so Sun asked where Lee had gone and where he was staying. But the boss got this confused look on his face. He said Lee was not on a business trip. Lee had been away from work, but because he had said he had this family issue that he needed to attend to. Sun didn't say anything in response to this, but this seemed like a major revelation. It meant Lee had very likely lied about where he was, at least to his boss and to his brother-in-law. Sun asked to see where Lee worked, and the boss led the police to an office filled with several desks. He then pointed them to Lee's desk and then left the cops on their own. Sun began rifling through Lee's desk, and under a stack of papers, he found a photograph of a woman, and it was not Zhao. Then, Detective Sun caught a break that could only happen in a small, tight-knit community where basically everybody knew each other. One of the other officers who was with Sun looked at the photo of this woman and said he recognized her. He couldn't remember her name, but he was sure she had been Lee's girlfriend when they were younger. Detective Sun felt like he was onto something big. He already suspected Lee in this murder, and now this piece of evidence helped him come up with a theory. Maybe Lee murdered his wife and then went on the run to be with his old girlfriend. And lying about the business trip would have given Lee cover to be out of town for a couple of days before anybody thought something suspicious was going on. For the rest of the day, investigators spoke to Lee's friends, and finally, they found a man who could identify the woman in the photo. The man told them that the woman was definitely Lee's ex-girlfriend, but she had gotten married years ago and moved to a city that was about a 3-hour train ride away. So, the following morning, 2 days after Zhao's body had been found, Sun took a train ride. And he found Lee's ex-girlfriend at her house, but he realized pretty quickly this was a waste of time. Lee's ex answered all of Sun's questions, but she said she had not seen Lee or even exchanged letters with him in over a decade. So Sun turned right around and hopped back on the train for the long ride back home. And during this ride, Sun felt frustrated. He felt totally lost. Lee really seemed to have fled, but now Sun had no idea where to look for him. And he knew Lee had at least a couple of days' jump on him. Moreover, traveling by train through smaller towns in this region would allow Lee to almost completely disappear, because a lot of those trains didn't require a passenger to provide identification. Sun could ask for help from other police departments, but Lee could be almost anywhere in China by this point. Hours later, Sun got back to the police station, and he was surprised when the chief greeted him with a huge smile on his face. Sun asked him if there had been some miraculous break in the case while he was gone. The chief said no, nothing like that had happened. However, he did have something exciting to show him. The chief walked with Sun out back behind the station, and immediately Sun's face lit up. The other officers were all out there, standing next to a row of brand new bicycles. The chief told Sun he had met with members of the city government and discussed the murder case they were dealing with, and he told them it was larger in scope than anything they had ever dealt with. And so the city government wanted to help the police solve the crime, and they figured by giving them bicycles, that would help them cover more ground and also just generally speed up the process. Even though Sun had spent most of the day feeling really bad about his investigation, feeling like it was going nowhere, now he couldn't help but feel rejuvenated. These bikes were a huge deal. It meant his team could travel much farther and talk to more people far more efficiently. And Sun reminded himself that this was a community where almost everybody knew everybody. So someone out there had to know something about Lee that could point the police in the right direction. They just had to go out there and find that person. Over the next several days, Soon and his team were out in force on their bikes, speaking to Lee's friends, his family, and just people all over the community. And finally, about a week after the discovery of Zhao's body, their work paid off. Police got a tip from a factory worker in town. The man didn't say much, but he told them to take a closer look into a robbery that had taken place at the factory's warehouse. Soon was quite familiar with this robbery. It had been a big deal in town. A large quantity of expensive steel pipes had been stolen from that warehouse, but the case had gone unsolved for months. Soon didn't see how stolen pipes could possibly connect to Zhao's murder, but he'd been desperate for any new leads, and now he felt like he had one. So he took his bike and rode right over to the warehouse. When Soon walked inside, he saw men driving lifts through this vast open space, transporting materials across the floor to get ready for shipping. One of the shift managers waved at Soon and then trotted across the floor to meet him. The guy was in his late 20s, and he introduced himself as Ho Lei Chiang. He led Soon into a nearby office that he said would be quieter than the warehouse floor. Once inside, Soon took a seat at a desk across from Ho and right away asked him what he knew about the missing steel pipes. Ho said he didn't know much, just that 8 tons of steel had been taken. And also, he said whoever pulled the job must have had access to the warehouse equipment, trucks, and a team of people. Ripping off that much steel was not a fast or easy job. The detective agreed. It must have been an enormous undertaking. So he asked Ho if there was anybody he could think of who might have been capable of pulling something like that off. All of a sudden, Ho seemed nervous. Sun picked up on it and asked if he was okay, and in a quiet voice, Ho said he did have an idea about who was behind the robbery, but he was afraid to say. Sun leaned forward and told Ho he needed to talk, because otherwise, people would think he was covering up for a criminal. Ho nodded and then said there was a man police needed to look into. He was a guy who worked for a local supply company, and his name was Li Xiangdong. Detective Sun felt like he had just been given a huge gift. It looked like he could have a clear connection between the warehouse robbery and Li, his murder victim's husband, who apparently had gone on the run. A couple weeks later, in early August, Detective Soon and his team continued to collect more information on Lee's possible involvement in the warehouse robbery. But they still weren't any closer to tracking him down. Soon sat at his desk, poring over his notes from the robbery and the murder case like he did every day. And suddenly, he heard someone run into the building, screaming. It was a man who was dripping with sweat and looked like he might pass out. Soon ran over to him, grabbed the man a chair so he could sit down, and asked him what was wrong. The man told him he had been out walking in the mountains just outside of town, and he saw these 4 guys pour gasoline over another man and then light him on fire. For a second, Soon just stood there in shock. But then he snapped out of it, got the exact location of where this man had been, and then he rallied his team together. The officers all ran outside, got on their bikes, and rode off to investigate their second burned body in a matter of weeks. The area where this man had come from, where he had seen this guy get lit on fire, was about 9 miles away from where Zhao had been found. And when the investigators arrived there, they left their bikes and walked down this long tree-lined path toward a clearing near the foot of a mountain. And as they got closer, the smell of burning flesh filled the air. Eventually, the investigators walked into a clearing. And there, they were quite surprised to find 4 men still standing over a body that had smoke rising from it. The men's heads were bowed, almost in reverence. Detective Sun immediately began to approach these men to potentially apprehend them, but none of the men tried to flee the scene like he expected them to. Instead, when they noticed him coming, one of these men just told the detective that nothing illegal was going on here. The police had simply stumbled onto a sacred ritual. Now, Detective Sun was not the most religious guy, but he was pretty sure no legal rituals included burning someone alive. But the man explained to him they were not burning someone who was alive. They were burning a dead body. All of them were miners, and their friend had died in a mining accident. They believed that someone who died in an accident should not be buried in a cemetery. Instead, the body had to be burned. Sun just stared at the man. He had no idea what to think about this. He would need to check with the mine to see if someone really had died in an accident, and he would need to research religious customs to see if these men were telling the truth. And on top of all that, he now had absolutely no idea if this burning body had any connection to Zhao's murder. But as Sun stood there looking at the burnt body on the ground, something hit him. It was so obvious that he got mad at himself for taking this long to think of it. Just like with Zhao, the man on the ground was so badly burned that it would be impossible to identify him by his looks. Sun turned to one of the other officers, and he could barely contain his excitement. He said he had just realized that the reason Zhao's killer had burned her was so she would be totally unrecognizable. And more importantly, because police had kept the news of Zhao's death out of the media, the killer probably believed Zhao still had not been identified. And suddenly, Sun had a plan to draw the killer out of hiding. Other members of Sun's team dealt with the body that was found near the mountain, and they would quickly discover the miners had been telling the truth about what they were doing. And as bizarre and unsettling as the ritual had seemed to Sun, it had actually been a huge help to his investigation, and he quickly put the first part of his new plan into action. Sun visited with Zhao's brother and sister. He asked them to start talking publicly about how they were both going to be interviewed soon by the police about a possible murder. Sun felt certain that the news that Zhao's brother and sister were going to meet with the cops would get back to the killer. And Sun believed that the killer, at that point, would reach out to Zhao's siblings in an attempt to keep them from speaking to the police. And it would not take long for Sun to be proven right. 3 days after Sun set his plan in motion, Zhao's sister walked out of her house and found a letter taped to her window. She read it and immediately ran to her brother's house, and then together they brought the letter to Detective Sun. The letter was from Zhao's husband, Li. It said that he and Zhao were together and they were okay, but they had gotten mixed up in something pretty bad, so they had to flee the city for now. They knew their daughter would be taken care of for the time being, and they'd get back in touch as soon as it was safe. Li closed it out by telling his sister-in-law to burn the letter. When Sun read this letter, he knew they were close to solving this case. It would take Sun and his team a bit more time to tie everything together, but soon would figure out exactly what happened to Zhao. Based on the letter that Zhao's sister received, crime scene evidence, and interviews conducted throughout the investigation, this is what police believe happened to Zhao on July 25, 1984. The killer stood next to their bicycle at the end of Zhao's street as the sun set behind the mountains. They heard bike tires on the road and saw Zhao coming their way. The killer smiled at Zhao, got on their bike, and started riding right alongside her. As it got darker, the killer pulled in front of Zhao and led her towards the river, not too far from their neighborhood. As the killer did this, they told Zhao they wouldn't have to ride much further, and soon they would both be able to forget about the secret they were both hiding. The killer and Zhao reached the riverbank, and from there they could see farmland on the other side of the river. The killer said they would need to cross the river and get to that farmland. So Zhao got off her bike and laid it on the ground, as did the killer, and then she and the killer walked across the river, which was very shallow, and then when they reached the other side and were on that riverbank, the killer's footprints very quickly disappeared from the wet ground. However, Zhao's did not. Zhao began to head up for the farmland, but the killer grabbed her by the arm, leaned in close, and whispered something in her ear. And as soon as they did, Zhao's eyes went wide and she began to tremble in fear, and she shoved the killer and tried to run, but the killer grabbed her from behind, threw her to the ground, and ripped off her shirt and pants. The killer sexually assaulted Zhao. The whole time, Zhao remained quiet and submissive, perhaps hoping that when this was over, she'd be let go. But no. When the killer was done, they wrapped their hands around Zhao's neck and began choking her. Zhao coughed and fought for air, but eventually everything went black. The killer tossed Zhao's clothes right next to her, and then walked to the nearby farm where they'd hidden a gas can. They returned to the riverbank and poured gasoline all over Zhao. Then they stepped several feet away from her, put the gas can down, lit a match, and threw it on Zhao. Suddenly, Zhao woke up screaming. She felt her skin burning and peeling away from her. She was engulfed in flames. Zhao heard the river running nearby, and on instinct, she got up and ran towards the sound. Her red sandals fell off and she stumbled forward. The killer looked on in shock. They couldn't believe Zhao had woken up. Eventually, the killer just ran towards her, not really sure what they were going to do, but before they reached her, Zhao had collapsed on the riverbank near a tree, still engulfed in flames. Zhao would let out one final scream, and then she would die. The killer waited several more minutes and just watched Zhao's body continue to burn. Then they grabbed the gas can, walked back across the water, picked up the bikes, and disappeared into the darkness. It would turn out Ho Lei-xiang, the warehouse worker who told Detective Sun that the steel pipe robbery could have been committed by Zhao's husband Li, was telling the truth. Li really had robbed the warehouse. But Ho was his partner in crime. Ho had masterminded the robbery, and then Li had sold the goods directly to a company he often worked with as a supplier, making them both a ton of money. Zhao's big secret, the one she had been desperately trying to hide from everybody, was that she knew what Ho and her husband had done. Because a couple of months after the robbery, Li had panicked and told Zhao everything. Zhao was disgusted and couldn't believe he had put his family in jeopardy just to make a quick buck. When Ho caught wind of all this drama, he decided he would step in and try to handle it. So he came up with this plan for Li to tell everybody he was going on a business trip, and then in reality, he would just go on the run. He would disappear from town. Zhao was aware of this plan, and she was under the impression that at some point, she and her daughter would also basically go on the run, connect with Li, and they would start a new life somewhere else. That's basically what Ho had promised them. But on July 25th, the day Zhao was killed, Ho went to see Zhao at her house, and he told her that Li had actually come back into town undercover. Ho said he could lead her to him, and then she and her husband could escape before the law caught up with them, and then once they were safe, they could send for their daughter and start their new life. However, later that night, when Ho and Zhao got across the river, it was Ho who whispered in Zhao's ear that Li wasn't there, and that in fact, he'd lured her here just to make sure she never told the police anything about the robbery. Then it was Ho who sexually assaulted Zhao and burned her to death. But that was not the only horrific crime Ho had committed. Because Li had followed his advice and planned to leave town and go into hiding like he suggested. But right before Li was about to leave town, which was days before Zhao was killed, Ho met up with Li, beat him to death with a hammer, and then disposed of his body outside of the city. So after all of this, Ho believed he'd gotten away with 2 murders. But when that letter that was supposedly written by Li arrived at Zhao's sister's house, Detective Sun compared it to other letters Li had written, and he quickly realized the handwriting didn't match. So Sun began working with a handwriting analysis expert and compared the letter to documents and correspondence from Li's family and friends, and from employees who worked at the warehouse that had been robbed, and that's how Sun figured out that Ho had actually written that letter. Police would eventually locate Li's body, at which point Ho would confess to everything. Ho was sentenced to death and was executed, all to cover up some stolen pipes. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In a rural area of southwest Texas in 2016, a 49-year-old woman was out walking her dog. We don't know her name, so we'll call her Rhonda, and we don't know her dog's name, so the dog will be Max. Hiking with Max was Rhonda's way of unwinding and letting go of the day. As she walked, she took a moment to breathe in the fresh scent of pine trees and listen to the dried leaves crunch underneath her shoes. There was nobody else around, so Rhonda let Max off his leash. He ran ahead and played in the bushes, happy to be free after a day spent cooped up inside. But after a little while, a sharp yelp from Max cut through the quiet evening air. Rhonda sprinted down the path to where she last saw him and began shouting out his name. There were plenty of dangerous animals hiding in the tall brush. Snakes, kissing bugs, porcupines, even feral hogs were known to be spotted in this area. Max could have run into any one of them. Rhonda yelled again and again for Max, but she didn't hear anything. Then she heard whining, and Max came running toward her with his tail between his legs. Rhonda immediately clipped on his leash, relieved that he didn't have any visible injury. Rhonda decided to end the walk right there and head home. And then once she got there, she could clean Max up and make herself some dinner. The next few days were uneventful, but towards the end of that week, Rhonda started to feel under the weather. She didn't have much of an appetite, and it hurt whenever she swallowed cold drinks. She figured she might have a mild flu or maybe a sore throat, but as the days went by, she kept feeling worse and worse. She couldn't catch her breath, and her chest hurt, and no matter what she did, Rhonda just could not get comfortable, especially when she laid down. Rhonda had high blood pressure, which had caused symptoms like this in the past, but she had been faithfully taking her blood pressure medication, so she didn't understand why she was now feeling this bad. She decided not to take any chances and went to the emergency room of a nearby hospital. As Rhonda sat in the waiting room, all she could think about was the pain in her chest. Whatever this was, it didn't feel like a simple blood pressure issue. A nurse asked Rhonda some basic background questions, like whether she drank alcohol or used tobacco. She admitted to having the occasional drink, but she said she never smoked. She said she didn't do any drugs either. Then, Rhonda was given an electrocardiogram, which is a simple test that records the electrical activity of the heart and indicates any problems with the heartbeat. After the test was done, a doctor came in and read through the results. He said everything looked perfectly fine, but Rhonda told him she was scared. She was certain there was something going on, but he just shook his head and told her she should stay calm. She was probably just having some sort of panic attack. But despite her protests, Rhonda was just given a prescription for anxiety medication and then sent home. But as the week progressed, her pain only got worse. Rhonda couldn't take 2 steps without feeling nauseous. She felt like something heavy was sitting on her chest, trying to squeeze out her breath. Even her dog Max seemed to sense her pain, whining every time she sat up in bed, trying to catch her breath. Rhonda decided to go back to the ER, but this time she went to a different hospital. She didn't want to be sick, but she also didn't want a potentially dangerous condition to go untreated. And the doctors at this hospital were much more willing to listen to Rhonda. In addition to the same test she got at the other ER, this ER also ordered a CAT scan of Rhonda's chest, which is a procedure that uses a series of X-rays to create detailed images inside the body. This time, when the doctor came to Rhonda's bedside to go over her test results, Rhonda could instantly tell something was wrong. The doctor told Rhonda that there was fluid collecting in her chest. This fluid was putting pressure on her heart and causing her to feel tired and breathless. He didn't know why this fluid was collecting, but they needed to keep a close eye on it. If the pressure built up too much, Rhonda's heart could be permanently damaged. Rhonda was then officially moved from the ER to a room in the hospital itself. She was nervous but also relieved. They might not know exactly what was wrong with her yet, but at least they weren't insisting that it was just an anxiety attack. By early the next morning, Rhonda's symptoms had not improved, and even with the pain medication, she could barely sleep. Her chest still hurt too much. A nurse came into Rhonda's room to draw blood, but right after the nurse inserted the needle into Rhonda's arm, something strange happened. Rhonda's feet and hands started turning blue. At the same time, her heart rate slowed and her blood pressure plummeted. The pain in Rhonda's chest grew worse, and she tried not to groan. Instead, she clenched her hands into fists so tight her nails almost cut through her skin. She thought of poor Max waiting for her at home. All she wanted was to cuddle with him and feel his wet nose on her face. As doctors rushed in, Rhonda could tell that things were just getting worse. The doctors measured her heartbeat and then gave her an injection to increase her heart rate and blood pressure. Once Rhonda was stabilized, her cardiologist arrived at her bedside. He could see that the excess fluid around Rhonda's heart was exerting more pressure. It was getting so intense that it could stop her heart from beating. There was no time for the doctor to make a precise diagnosis. Rhonda needed surgery right now. That fluid had to be drained or she was going to die. They could figure out what was actually wrong with her afterwards. Rhonda was rushed into surgery, and doctors removed almost 2 cups of fluid from the sac surrounding Rhonda's heart. They also put in a chest tube that would help keep the fluid from building back up. Her cardiologist hoped that the procedure would be enough to stabilize her. Right away, Rhonda started to feel better. Her vital signs improved, and she was able to eat a little bit and even check in with her dog sitter. After almost 2 weeks of feeling totally sick, and now 48 hours in the hospital, Rhonda told herself that this terrible ordeal might finally be over. Over the next couple of days, she improved enough for her doctors to remove the chest tube that was draining the excess fluid from her heart. But just after getting the chest tube removed, Rhonda again started feeling intense pressure in her chest. More tests were done, and they revealed that fluid was reaccumulating around her heart at an alarming rate. Rhonda's blood pressure suddenly dropped, and her body went into shock. Her surgical team sprang back into action. Once again, she was wheeled into surgery to drain the fluid from around her heart. This time, almost 4 cups were removed, twice as much as the first time. Rhonda's cardiologist and his team placed 3 chest tubes around Rhonda's heart to keep the waves of pressure from killing her. After surgery, Rhonda was returned to the ICU, exhausted and barely conscious. But even all those tubes couldn't stop the fluid from building back up. Instead of getting better, Rhonda remained in critical condition. They were running out of time to save her. Her doctors watched over her with a sense of dread, wondering how they could possibly stabilize her if she crashed again. 6 terrifying days later, doctors drained her heart for the 3rd time. This time, though, her cardiologist noticed something strange in the bloody liquid they drained out of her chest. He examined it and realized that the liquid was full of blood clots. Rhonda must be bleeding internally. If one of those clots made its way into her heart, it could block an important artery. This would cause cardiac arrest and kill Rhonda in seconds. Her cardiologist ordered more scans and then carefully studied each one. And that's when he noticed something truly puzzling. Rhonda's aorta, which is the large artery connected to the heart, showed a small, thin shadow. The cardiologist was baffled by it. He knew it had to be connected to the bleeding, but he couldn't tell what it was, and he had to find out. To do this, he needed to see Rhonda's heart completely still and without any blood to obscure the view. While it sounded impossible, there was a way to do this. He needed to perform an incredibly dangerous surgery, the kind of surgery that he would only do when there was no other choice. He dreaded reaching this decision, but it was the only way to save her life. Rhonda would have to be put into a state called total circulatory arrest. The surgical team would do this by first drastically lowering her body temperature. Then they would have to stop her heart from pumping. Rhonda would be in suspended animation, with no pulse, no blood pressure, and no signs of brain activity. She would basically be no different from someone who was actually dead. Putting Rhonda into the state would allow her doctors to see what was wrong with her heart, but it only gave surgeons an extremely short window of time to work, about 40 minutes. If it went on any longer, they might not be able to bring Rhonda back. As the surgical suite was prepped for the procedure, the cardiologist and his team went through every minute detail of the operation. Then the surgeon took a deep breath and began the process of putting Rhonda into deep hypothermic circulatory arrest. A cooled saline solution was slowly injected into Rhonda's blood. This lowered her body temperature to somewhere between 64 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit and caused her blood to stop flowing. A machine took over her breathing. Once all her body functions had stopped, the cardiologist called for a scalpel and made his first incision. The entire surgical team watched as he cut through the sac surrounding Rhonda's heart, carefully pushing aside tiny blood vessels until he was able to make an incision in the aorta. Wearing specialized magnifying glasses, he carefully examined Rhonda's heart. Within moments, he was stunned to see an object deeply embedded inside of her aorta. He carefully removed it with micro forceps and dropped it in a specimen jar. Then he cut out the damaged part of the aorta repaired it with the synthetic graft, and closed Rhonda back up. Then, the team slowly and carefully raised Rhonda's body temperature, her heart was restarted with a defibrillator. In minutes, blood was pumping through her veins again, and color started to return to her face. As Rhonda was wheeled back to the ICU to recover, the object that had been pulled out of her aorta was already being closely examined by pathology. By the next day, Rhonda's medical team knew the very risky surgery had worked. The fluid had stopped accumulating around Rhonda's heart, and she said she was starting to feel better. Over the next several days, the lab analyzed this object that had been pulled out of her that had basically pierced a hole through her aorta. Rhonda was in her hospital room chatting with some family when her cardiologist entered, holding something in a small glass jar. He told her that the pathology department had a little present for her. They knew what had caused her near-death crisis. The object from her aorta that had nearly killed her was an inch-long, black and extremely sharp porcupine quill. But now the question was, how had it gotten inside of her? It happened more than a month earlier, on the day she went for a walk with her dog Max in the woods. When Max ran into the brush and began whimpering and whining, he had encountered an angry porcupine. Later, when Rhonda got home, she saw several quills sticking out of Max's fur. Rhonda had painstakingly removed them, but while she was doing this, she had accidentally swallowed a porcupine quill and somehow didn't notice. The quill poked a hole in her esophagus and then made its way to her aorta, where it caused her to bleed into the sac around her heart. Since she had no idea that she had swallowed a quill, she never thought it was necessary to tell her doctors about the incident with her dog and the porcupine. 3 weeks after she was first admitted to the hospital, Rhonda made a full recovery and went home. She still went on long walks with Max and still let him run free into the brush. She wasn't the kind of person who lived in fear, but her heart always started to beat a little faster whenever Max ran out of sight for more than a few minutes. Somewhere out there in the brush, there might still be a stubborn porcupine with a few missing quills waddling around. And now here is our second story called The Experiment. On a spring evening in 2014, 43-year-old Amy Pearl looked out the kitchen window of her neighbor's brownstone in Brooklyn, New York. About 20 people were packed into the tiny backyard for a cookout. Amy was making a vegetable dish, so she was sautéing some wild onions that she'd picked from her mother's garden. After the onions were ready, she headed outside to join the party, where the host was now cooking a giant rack of lamb on a charcoal grill. Amy mingled with her friends until it was time to eat. Then they all sat down at a long table. The lamb, wild onions, and assorted roasted vegetables made for a delicious meal. Amy even sneaked some meat to her dog, a brown and white pit bull mutt named Cola. Amy couldn't help but think about how lucky she was. She was a successful radio producer living just minutes away from Manhattan, in a city full of things to do and great food to eat. And she had a group of amazing friends to enjoy it with. A few hours later, the party ended, so Amy said her goodbyes and headed back to her own apartment with her dog. After she got home, Amy went to bed. It was midnight and she was ready to get some sleep. But a couple of hours later, she woke up and just felt totally strange. A wave of anxiety hit her, but she wasn't sure why. She decided to get up and go to the bathroom. When she walked in and flipped on the light, she took a look at her face in the mirror. She was shocked when she saw her reflection. Her face looked misshapen and her eyes were swollen. Amy could barely recognize herself and immediately knew something was wrong. Then she was hit by this awful dizzy spell. In a daze, Amy walked back toward her bedroom. She was so dizzy she had to hold on to the walls for support, but she managed to get back to her room and climb into her bed. As soon as she lay down, she felt like she was going to pass out. Amy stood back up and attempted to walk off her dizziness as her dog, Cola, followed her around the apartment. As she paced around, Amy started to have these intense stomach cramps. Her mind began to race, and she wondered what was happening. Amy wondered if she had accidentally poisoned herself with something she ate from the dinner party. She thought maybe there might have been a snail hidden on the wild onions, or maybe the onions themselves were just poisonous. She was worried she might have poisoned her friends too. So far, no one had texted or called her though, so she hoped everything was okay. As her anxiety intensified, Amy got up and returned to the bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, which helped calm her down a bit. She dried her face off with a hand towel and realized she no longer felt dizzy. Amy told herself that maybe a night's rest would just fix everything, so she returned to her bedroom and finally fell asleep. The next morning, Amy woke up feeling much better. Her stomach had stopped hurting and her face looked normal again. However, she wanted to figure out what had happened. She figured the best way to start was to check in on her friends who had gone to the same party the night before. Amy picked up her phone and dialed the neighbor who had hosted the cookout. She didn't want to alarm them by talking about her symptoms, so she just asked them how they felt the party went. The host was very happy with everything and thanked Amy for making the wild onions. Amy got off the phone feeling totally relieved, and so she called some more people who attended the party, and again, everyone just seemed fine and had a great time. Amy was left totally bewildered and without any answers about what had happened to her, but she ultimately just chalked up the whole thing to an upset stomach and tried to move on. A week later, on a Saturday night, Amy decided to stay in with her dog, Cola, instead of going out with her friends. She decided to make a cheeseburger and french fries for dinner, so she pulled a frozen patty out of the freezer and turned on the stove. When the burger was done, Amy placed a slice of cheese right on top and watched it melt. Then she put the burger on a bun and added the fries that she had cooked in the oven. Amy grabbed a can of soda from her fridge, she sat down on the couch next to Cola, and took her first bite of the burger. The patty was a pink medium rare, the cheese was melted and gooey, and the fries were perfectly salted. Amy savored every bite and then watched a movie. 2 hours later, as the credits of the movie began to roll, Amy hugged her dog. As he licked her face, she started to feel lightheaded. She stood up too quickly and nearly fell over. Amy braced herself against the wall and struggled to catch her breath. Her chest began to tighten, and she started breathing faster and faster, and so kind of in a panic, Amy began trying to take deep breaths to calm herself down, and as her breathing did begin to settle, all she could think about was what had happened to her after her neighborhood party a week earlier. But this felt different, and much worse. Amy made her way into the bathroom, and just like last week, she looked in the mirror and her face looked swollen, and now she noticed there was also a rash on her hands. She lifted her shirt and saw that her stomach was also covered in swollen red hives. She didn't know what to do. Her only thought was to make her way to the living room and unlock her front door, just in case she needed to call 911 but passed out before paramedics arrived. Then she staggered into her bedroom as Cola followed along. Amy wondered if there was a virus going around, or if maybe she was allergic to a new pollen, or worse, maybe she was allergic to her dog Cola. Amy didn't want to think about that possibility because she loved her dog. She remembered how helpful sleep had been the last time this happened a week earlier, so she decided not to call 911 just yet. She relocked her front door and made her way back to her room. Exhausted, she collapsed onto her bed and she fell asleep. Just like the last time she got sick, Amy woke up the next morning feeling much better. The swelling on her stomach had gone down, and the hives were less noticeable, but she was still worried, so she grabbed her laptop off the floor. She opened a web browser and typed all of her symptoms into the Google search bar. A list of articles and links popped up. Amy scanned the list, her eyes widening as she saw a particular article. She clicked that link and read more. It was about a man in Florida who had experienced the same sudden symptoms as her. She wasn't sure what it all meant, but maybe it was connected to what was happening with her. Amy printed out the article because she felt like she was onto something. A few days later, Amy was seated on the examination table as her doctor stood close by. Her hives had disappeared by the time her appointment had arrived, and the doctor didn't seem too worried. Despite this, Amy described the two incidents and her various symptoms in great detail as the doctor took notes. But the entire time, Amy was thinking about the article she had printed out. She had even brought it with her to the appointment. Amy hesitated to bring up the article to her doctor. She didn't want to sound like one of those people who self-diagnosed based on what they read online. Instead, when she was on her way out of the appointment, she left the article with the receptionist and asked them to please give it to her doctor. The next day, Amy called the doctor and asked whether she could be tested for the condition the article mentioned. The doctor said he had read the article and that in his opinion, it just wasn't possible. Amy had nothing to worry about, and he didn't think she needed to do any special testing. He was confident that it was just not a problem. Amy felt kind of defeated and no closer to knowing what had actually happened to her. A few days later, Amy was back to feeling basically like herself. She was at the local supermarket, pushing a cart full of groceries down the aisle. She eyed the food in her cart and was struck with an idea. Her doctor had seemed so sure there wasn't anything wrong with her, but Amy wasn't as certain, so she decided to run a test on herself. She would go to her mom's house and do the experiment there, just in case something terrible happened. Later that afternoon, Amy's mother, Susan Von Eggers, stood at the island in her kitchen in Danbury, Connecticut, about 2 hours away from Brooklyn. Susan was cutting up vegetables from her garden when she heard a knock at the door. She walked over to let in Amy, and then she gave her a hug. As Susan led her daughter back to the kitchen, Amy told her about this experiment she had planned. She was going to cook some food and eat it as a test, then wait to see if she got sick. Susan didn't know what to make out of Amy's experiment, but she was determined to help her daughter figure out what had made her so sick. Susan walked out into the spacious backyard, where she fired up the grill, and then they cooked their meal. Shortly after, they took a seat at the patio table. It was time for the experiment. Susan watched closely as Amy took her first bite of food. Her daughter slowly chewed and swallowed. They both waited, but so far, nothing out of the ordinary happened. Then Susan began eating. She soon noticed that Amy had barely touched the rest of her food. Amy said she was just too nervous and didn't want to eat anymore. Susan felt bad for Amy. Normally, her daughter had a healthy appetite and a deep appreciation for food. But the next 2 hours went by and Susan and Amy relaxed in the backyard, chatting and enjoying the sunshine, and Amy just seemed totally fine, which was a huge relief for Susan. But several minutes later, she noticed Amy became very quiet and then grabbed at her stomach. She quickly excused herself to the bathroom. Susan watched, unsure what to do, as Amy jogged to the back door and disappeared inside. 20 minutes later, Amy returned and looked very pale. She asked if her mother could drive her to the emergency room. Susan's stomach dropped, and for a split second, she couldn't think straight. She jumped up and said she needed to change her clothes. Even as she said it, she realized how absurd it sounded. She frantically ran to her bedroom, but a minute later, she heard something slam against her door. Susan opened the door and saw that Amy had collapsed on the floor in the hallway. Susan immediately felt so bad for delaying getting Amy to the hospital. She ran over and kneeled down and leaned close to her daughter's face, and she could tell that Amy was still breathing. Susan found Amy's phone on the ground next to her. She realized that Amy must have thrown it at her door to get her attention. Susan picked up Amy's phone and she dialed 911. Paramedics arrived and immediately took Amy to the hospital. She was conscious when she arrived at the emergency room a few minutes later. She was immediately given a shot of a drug called epinephrine to prevent her from going into anaphylactic shock. Anaphylactic shock is a severe allergic reaction that can result in fainting, difficulty in breathing, and even death if it's not treated right away. Amy was able to speak, so she was able to tell the ER doctor what her theory was for what was going on with her. Amy wasn't sure the doctor believed her, but the doctor promised to run the necessary tests to prove or disprove Amy's theory. Amy was stabilized and moved to a hospital room. Her mother was by her side, and they waited anxiously for the results of the tests. A couple of hours later, the ER doctor rushed in. He said he knew exactly what was happening and that Amy had been right. The article Amy had found 2 weeks ago was about a man who had developed a meat allergy. The doctor who Amy had first shown this article to just didn't believe that it was possible that Amy could have this allergy and so did not think the test was necessary. But Amy was determined to find out, so she attempted that experiment, which unfortunately worked. She and her mom had grilled that porterhouse steak at her mom's house. Amy had only taken a couple of bites, but it was enough to set off an allergic reaction that almost killed her. And now the doctor in the ER confirmed it for her. Amy had a life-threatening allergy to red meat. Finally, Amy understood exactly what was wrong with her. But even though she had a diagnosis, she still wasn't satisfied. In fact, it led Amy to a bigger question. How could she have suddenly become allergic to something she had eaten without any issues her entire life? When her doctor explained the reason, it all made sense to her, as crazy as it sounded. It all started a few weeks before the neighborhood cookout, when Amy woke up one morning. The back of her arm felt itchy, and when she scratched it, she discovered a tick. She knew exactly where it had come from, her dog Cola. The tick had clearly been on her dog, and then hopped onto Amy in the middle of the night while Cola was sleeping in bed with her. When Amy was bitten by that tick, she developed a new allergy to red meat called alpha-gal syndrome. The tick carries a sugar molecule called alpha-gal, which is found in the blood of the animals the tick usually bites, such as cows, sheep, rabbits, deer, or pigs. When a tick bites a human, it automatically transmits alpha-gal into that person's body. After Amy was bitten, she developed a sensitivity to alpha-gal. This meant that her body now saw this sugar molecule as a foreign invader and attacked it. So every time Amy ate red meat, which contains alpha-gal, she would become progressively sicker. Her body would release histamines, which cause allergy symptoms such as hives, swelling, and difficulty breathing, as well as anaphylactic shock. It just so happens that Amy's symptoms were particularly severe. It is estimated that almost 450,000 people in the United States have developed alpha-gal allergy in the same way as Amy, which would make it the 10th most common allergy in the entire country. Up to 60% of people with red meat allergies can experience severe symptoms. There is currently no cure. After Amy learned about her diagnosis, she realized she could never eat red meat again, which included beef, venison, pork, and lamb. They had been her favorite foods since she was a kid. After being released from the hospital, she decided to go on a strict vegetarian diet for personal reasons. She continues to go see her allergist for testing to see if anything has changed, but her alpha-gal antibody levels are still present in her bloodstream. Now, Amy has made peace with the lifestyle change and has even learned to appreciate it, especially considering her deep love of animals. The United States formally entered World War II in December of 1941, following the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii by the Japanese. Roughly 6 months later, a 21-year-old Alabama native named Henry Irwin joined the Army Reserve. After nearly 2 years of additional military training, Henry was made into a radio operator and was assigned to a B-29 bomber. A B-29 bomber is this huge aircraft whose sole purpose is to drop bombs. And so in February of 1945, Henry and his B-29 bomber unit were sent to the Pacific to do just that, drop bombs on the Japanese. 2 months after arriving, Henry's B-29 was tasked with being the lead bomber in a group attack on a Japanese chemical facility located about 125 miles north of Tokyo. Aside from just operating his radio inside of the B-29, occasionally Henry's job was to organize the other planes in the attack when their B-29 was the lead attacker. And so the way he would do this was by dropping a series of smoke bombs out of his plane, and then once they touched the ground and all the smoke was coming up, he would hop on his radio and communicate with the other pilots in his sortie and tell them to organize themselves off of this visual reference point on the ground. He would basically have them fly to certain positions relative to the smoke cloud. And so once all the pilots had been organized into proper formation, they would continue to their target and commence their bombing raid. For this mission, Henry was in his typical position right behind the front turret gun towards the front of the plane. When his pilot told him to start dropping smoke bombs, Henry did as he was told. And so he pulled the lever, which opened up a chute on the bottom of the plane, and all these smoke bombs began tumbling out of it. Now, as soon as he pulled that lever, all of these smoke bombs that were in that particular chute were ignited. They were on a timed fuse. And so they would tumble out of the plane, and then before hitting the ground, they would ignite, and then smoke would start billowing out of them. But for some reason, after he pulled that lever, a couple of the smoke bombs fell out of the chute, but one of them kind of got turned around, and as it tumbled down, it kind of caught itself on the lip and bounced back up into the plane, and it struck Henry square in the face, shattering his nose, and then it ignited and literally lit Henry's face on fire, which instantly blinded him. Smoke bombs are not considered lethal devices because they do not explode the way typical bombs do. However, make no mistake about it, you would not want to be near a military-grade smoke bomb when it went off. In order for it to emit that very thick and long-lasting smoke that it does, the smoke bomb ignites a chemical fire within itself that burns extremely hot. And so when the smoke bomb came back inside the plane and ignited right in front of Henry, those chemicals landed on his face, and so that's why he caught on fire. And if that wasn't bad enough, the smoke bomb also filled the plane completely with smoke, making it impossible for the pilots to see anything. Despite his burning, shattered face, all Henry could think about was if he didn't get this smoke bomb off the plane in the next few seconds, they were all going to crash and die. So instead of trying to put out his burning face, Henry began feeling around on the ground for the smoke bomb, which again is basically like a fireball. And when he found it, he pulled it into his chest, trying to smother it as best as he could. And while his body completely engulfed in flames, Henry began low-crawling his way towards the front of the plane where he knew, just by touch, there was going to be a window. And so as he agonizingly crawled, he's on fire, he finally gets to this window, he can feel it above him, and he manages to lift the smoke bomb up and throws it out the window. And then afterwards, he collapses on the ground and he passes out completely on fire, fully expecting to die. A few seconds later, the smoke inside of the plane cleared because now the smoke bomb was gone, and the pilot who had put the plane on autopilot but did have to drop significantly in altitude because they were starting to stall, finally could see again and saw they were about 300 feet from hitting the water. And so he was able to pull back and get them out of their dive, and he narrowly escaped crashing into the water, and he turned around and began flying back to base. On this return trip, the crew, who were unhurt, began assessing the damage, and they saw Henry on fire on the side of the plane. And so they rushed over and they put him out with a fire extinguisher, expecting him to be dead. But to their shock and horror, he was still alive. And so they gave him morphine for his pain and expected him to die any moment. But Henry didn't die. Instead, he was very cheerful on the flight all the way back to base, and he would ask each of his crew members if they were okay, and they would all say, "Yeah, I'm just fine. It's really you who we're concerned about here." When the pilot finally landed back at base, Henry's body had stiffened up so dramatically from being on fire that the doctors couldn't actually get him out of the plane's side door. And so they had to dismantle the side of the plane to get Henry out. And so the doctors fully expected Henry was going to die basically any moment from his horrible wounds, but since he hadn't yet, they did everything they could to try to save him. They put him through dozens of surgeries, including one where they would try to remove the chemical flecks from the smoke bomb that had embedded in his eyes. And since these chemicals combusted as soon as they made contact with oxygen, every time they pulled out one of these flecks, it would burst into flames and very painfully burn Henry's eyes a little bit more. While Henry was undergoing all these surgeries, the rest of his B-29 crew immediately went to their commanding officer and said, "You have to put Henry in for the Medal of Honor." The Medal of Honor is the highest award you can achieve in the US military. After the commanding officer heard the story of what Henry had done, he agreed, and in record time, he got the paperwork processed and got Henry approved for this award. But there were no actual physical medals of honor on the island to actually present to Henry, and the officers and the rest of his crew were worried Henry would die before the actual medal was shipped out to the island to be given to him. And so the only Medal of Honor that was on this island was inside of a museum behind a glass case. And so one of the officers in Henry's crew went into the museum, shattered the case, took the display Medal of Honor, and rushed to Henry's bedside and put it around his neck. And then after that, somehow, Henry just didn't die. After dozens and dozens of surgeries, Henry actually regained sight in one of his eyes and regained the use of most of his body. Henry would later be asked in an interview what it was like to do this very heroic thing that he did. And he would say, "Well, I only moved the bomb 13 feet, but 13 feet feels like 13 miles when you're on fire. Henry would go on to be honorably discharged from the military, and he would spend the next 37 years working closely with other burn victims, trying to keep them positive and optimistic about their recovery. He would also go on to have 4 children, one of which became an Alabama state senator. In 2002, Henry died of natural causes at the age of 80. Our next story is called Mad Jack. In 1926, Jack Churchill graduated from one of the UK's most prestigious military academies called Sandhurst, thus becoming an army officer. His first assignment was to an infantry unit stationed in Burma, but when he got there, it was peacetime, so Jack didn't have much to do. But instead of just sitting around all day, Jack did what any other restless young military officer would do, and he mastered the bagpipes, despite being 0% Scottish. He also took a trip across the entire Indian subcontinent on his motorcycle, almost entirely on unpaved roads. But in 1936, despite these incredible side hobbies, he just wasn't really that interested in being a part of the military when there wasn't anything going on, and so he decided to get out. He moved to Nairobi, Kenya, where he became a newspaper editor / male model / movie extra. During his off time, he still took his bagpiping very seriously, placing second in a prominent piping competition in 1938. He also picked up another hobby, archery, and he became so good at it so quickly that he was chosen by England to represent them in the Archery World Championships in 1939. Later that same year, when World War II broke out, Jack decided now's a good time to get back into the army. So he rejoined the army, and he was promptly sent to France to help defend their borders against a potential Nazi invasion. But shortly after Jack arrived, Hitler was able to push through those defenses, and he launched a brutal blitzkrieg campaign against the Allies in France. Blitzkrieg is a military tactic that's basically an all-out attack, all at once, with everything you got. So planes, tanks, artillery, infantry, you just send all of it in an attempt to overwhelm your enemy before you run out of resources. And in this case, Hitler's blitzkrieg was successful. In just 6 weeks, they not only invaded France, they conquered it. But during that 6-week battle for France that the Allies ultimately lost, Jack made a name for himself by employing 2 particular weapons that nobody else in World War II was using. He is the only one who used these weapons for the entirety of World War II. Jack and 2 other infantrymen were up on this hill overlooking this town that was full of Nazis, and at some point 5 Nazis come running out to the edge of this town, and they duck behind a wall that's about 30 meters away from Jack. And one of these Nazis stands up and quickly crumples to the ground. And his 4 Nazi comrades look to see what happened to him, and they see a dead man on the ground with the back end of an arrow jutting out of his chest. And that arrow was fired by none other than Jack Churchill. Because for the duration of World War II, he didn't carry a gun. He didn't need a gun. Instead, he carried a bow and arrow and a long broadsword. Although periodically he would scoop the weapons up off of dead enemy soldiers, and he would fire those. When asked why he didn't just carry a gun in the first place, he responded, "Any officer that goes into action without his sword is improperly dressed." From then on, he became Mad Jack, and his peers loved him. But his leadership hated him. They said he was setting a terrible example, that no one should be running around with a sword and a bow and arrow. But he was so effective, they let him continue. Throughout the brutal 6-week battle for France, Jack would lead dozens of these small raids against the Nazis, and he would just pick them off one by one with his bow and arrow and with his sword. And in one particular raid, he got shot through the neck, but he was so nonchalant about it that when he got back to base, someone was like, "Hey, Jack, you're bleeding." And he was like, "Oh, yeah, I am." They were like, "Well, what happened?" He's like, machine gun. After the Allies finally lost this battle for France and were forced to evacuate, they found a diary from one of the British soldiers, and in it he talks about the one thing that motivated him and the other troops around him, and that was the sight of Mad Jack running hither and thither with his bow and arrow and his broadsword. For his bravery in France, Jack was awarded the Military Cross. After leaving France, Jack heard about this new unit, the Commandos, that was being stood up to aggressively sabotage Nazi operations, and they were looking for volunteers. And Jack didn't know much about what they were going to do, but they promised combat, and so he was all for it, and he volunteered. The Commando unit would go on to become the famous British Special Forces, and the training they put Jack and the other volunteers through was absolutely brutal. and Jack just loved it. He loved being in the commandos. After graduation in 1941, Jack was put in command of a commando unit that was tasked with going to this Norwegian town of Vågsøy and taking down a Nazi garrison there. And so they loaded up into their amphibious landing craft, and Jack's got his kilt on, and he's got his bagpipes, and he plays the bagpipes on the entire transit over to Vågsøy to pump up the commandos. And then Jack's landing craft was the first to reach the shores, and when its ramp came down, Jack was the first off, and he just kept playing his bagpipes, despite the fact that the Nazis now see them, and they're shooting at him. So rounds are impacting around him as he's blaring his bagpipes, and only when he finished his song did he shoulder his bagpipes, pull out a grenade. He saw some Nazis running along the ridgeline. He throws a grenade at them, and pulls out his sword and runs into battle. In just a few hours, the Nazi garrison had fallen, and Jack was awarded his second military cross. During the Italian amphibious landings in 1943, Jack again was in charge of a commando unit, and they were tasked with capturing a Nazi observation post that was in this town just outside of Salerno. It was well defended and fortified, and Jack and his men were outnumbered 20-1. So Jack came up with a genius plan. Instead of using stealth tactics, he broke his small team into 6 different groups, and he placed them all around the outside of this town. And it was nighttime, so the Nazis did not see them setting up. And then on Jack's call, he had them all yell out at the exact same time, "Commando!" And the Nazis in the town were so caught off guard by all this yelling coming from all around them, they assumed a huge force is coming to take over this town. And so they went on the defensive. And so after their big war cry, Jack and his group are the first to charge down into this town, and Jack and one other guy would actually splinter off, and they would discover this big group of Nazis that were setting up their mortars. And so Jack and this guy sneak up behind one of them, and Jack grabs him from behind, holds this sword to his throat, and orders him to tell the rest of the team to surrender. And so the rest of the team, who vastly outnumber Jack and the other guy, they turn around and they see this lunatic wearing a kilt, wielding a sword. He's got bagpipes slung over his shoulder along with a bow and arrow. And they're like, okay, we give up. Shortly after, the rest of the Nazis in this town would surrender to Jack and his men. And for his actions, Jack would be awarded the Distinguished Service Order. In 1944, Jack was in Yugoslavia with the commandos trying to capture a strategically valuable location called Point 62. And when every man in his team was either killed or severely wounded, and when Jack had run out of arrows, instead of surrendering, he pulled out his bagpipes and started playing until a grenade detonated behind him, knocking him unconscious. The Nazis captured him and sent him to Berlin to be interrogated because they believed, because of his last name, Churchill, that he was connected to or related to the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill. He wasn't, not at all, so they ordered Jack to be sent to a concentration camp. On his way out of Berlin, Jack secretly flicked a lit cigarette butt into one of his interrogator's offices, and he lit it on fire, but nobody knew it was him. And so Jack arrives at this concentration camp, and he's only there for a couple of months before he and another British military officer managed to escape by crawling underneath one of the barbed wire fences. They had slowly burrowed a tunnel without anybody noticing, and then they jumped down into this abandoned drainage pipe and they crawled out to freedom that way. But their freedom would be short-lived because they only made it a couple of miles before they were recaptured by the Nazis. And so they were ordered to go to another concentration camp that was considered much more secure. But after only having been at this new concentration camp for less than a year, once again, Jack was able to escape. This time, it was because there was a power outage at the camp, and Jack just put his shovel down and casually walked out the front gates, and nobody noticed. He walked 150 miles in the treacherous terrain of the Alps, surviving on vegetables he had stolen from people's gardens. And then finally, 8 days later, he came across a United States Armored Division, and they took him in and reconnected him with British troops, and then he was ultimately sent back to England. And while Jack was free, he was very frustrated that the war in Europe was effectively over and he had missed most of it. And so he requested a transfer to go out to Burma to fight against the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. But as soon as he got there, the Americans had just dropped the atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Japan, abruptly ending World War II. And when Jack heard about this, he was so disappointed he would not get to do any more fighting. He was quoted as saying, if it wasn't for those Yanks, we could have kept this war going for another 10 years. Even though the war was over, Jack desperately wanted to get into combat at least one more time, and so he went to jump school and qualified as a parachutist at the age of 40, and with this new qualification, he was assigned to a light infantry unit, and they were deployed to Palestine to train their army how to better fight the Arab forces. And while he was there, he gained even more fame when he defended a Jewish medical convoy from an Arab ambush, and he did this all while wearing a kilt. Another time, he and 12 of his men helped evacuate 700 people from a Jewish hospital that was under attack from Arab forces. After Palestine, Jack came back to England and eventually retired from the army, and then begrudgingly took a desk job within the Ministry of Defense. And every day on his commute home on the train, he would take his briefcase and throw it out the window as they were moving. What he had figured out was if he threw it at the exact right moment, it would land in the backyard of his house, and he wouldn't need to carry his briefcase from the station to his house. But he didn't explain that to any of the other passengers on the train. They just figured there's some crazy guy who keeps throwing his briefcases out the window. In his retirement, he also became an extremely talented surfer. And at one point, he wanted to surf the Severn Bore, which is this huge wave in southwestern England that nobody else had surfed before. And locals that were familiar with this treacherous wave, they cautioned him and said, "You really shouldn't do this." And he looked at them and he just said, "I'll be all right." And then he proceeded to be the first person ever to successfully ride that wave. Jack would ultimately die in 1996. He was 89 years old. The next and final story of today's episode is called Real Life Superhero. The United States formally entered World War II on December 8, 1941, after the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. At the time, Joseph Byerly was a senior at his high school in Muskegon, Michigan, and he had a scholarship to attend Notre Dame University the next year. But after his graduation in 1942, he decided he didn't want to go to college so long as other kids his age were going off to fight the war. And so he enlisted in the Army, and he immediately volunteered for one of the most dangerous units, the parachute infantry. Joseph completed a brutal, accelerated training regimen that included exhausting PT in blistering heat, extended forced marches, grueling full-kit runs up mountains, as well as both American and British jump schools. By 1943, Joseph was fully trained and stationed in England and was eager to put his training to the test. But the Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, also known as D-Day, was still a few months away. But Joseph didn't want to wait that long, so he volunteered for an incredibly dangerous mission that the OSS was recruiting paratroopers for. The OSS was the predecessor to the CIA. Basically, volunteers would parachute in the middle of the night into Nazi-occupied France with a backpack full of gold. Once they hit the ground, they'd meet up with the French resistance and give the gold to them, and then the resistance would do their best to protect these volunteer paratroopers and hopefully give them a ride back out to England. But by no means was it a guarantee, because many of these volunteers were killed in the process. This was some hardcore, deep cover spy work that the OSS would tell their volunteers, if you get caught on this mission, you're gonna get tortured and you're gonna get executed. Joseph would successfully complete this insane mission, and then he liked it so much, he did it again. Shortly after his second successful OSS mission, word came down that D-Day was set to take place on June 6th. Joseph's unit was told they were going to be parachuted into France the night before in order to destroy bridges, cut power supply lines, and generally soften up defenses before the main invasion happened just a couple of hours later at Utah Beach. So in the dead of night on June 5th, Joseph and his unit were flying over France when they were struck by enemy fire. And so as their plane is literally falling to the ground, Joseph leaps out the door when he's only 400 feet off the ground, and he manages to survive the jump, his parachute inflated just in time, but he landed on top of a church where a Nazi sniper was up in the steeple taking shots at all of the other paratroopers. And when the sniper saw Joseph on the roof, he began taking shots at him, and Joseph managed to dodge the rounds before slipping off the roof and running out of sight. Completely alone, with no idea where the rest of his unit was, Joseph took off running from the church and once again had to dodge more sniper fire, and he eventually made it to the town's power substation, which he blew up with thermite. So he cut the power to the town, and from there he went building to building to building, killing every Nazi he came across, including an entire squad of Nazi infantry that he ambushed with grenades. At some point, Joseph made his way over to one of the bridges leading into this town that if he blew up, it would prevent Nazis from sending reinforcements to Utah Beach. But as he crawled through one of the hedgerows, he fell headfirst into a Nazi machine gun nest, and when he turned around, there were a bunch of machine guns pointed at his face, and so he surrendered. Joseph was marched deeper into France to a POW holding area, and as soon as he got there, explosions ripped out all around him. It wasn't clear if it was German artillery or American aircraft, but whatever it was killing both Germans and American POWs. Joseph took shrapnel to the leg and was blown into a ditch, and despite being in excruciating pain, he took this as an opportunity to escape. And so he got up and ran away as best as he could with his injury, and for 12 hours he remained uncaught behind enemy lines before he was ultimately caught again. This time they put Joseph in the back of a covered locked truck to keep him from escaping, and they decided they would send him to St. Lo and decide what to do with him there. But on their transit to St. Lo, an Allied aircraft strafed the vehicle that Joseph was in, and Joseph survived the attack and was able to leap out of one of the holes in the side of the truck from this attack, and he attempted to escape, but once again he was caught. The Nazis finally got Joseph to St. Lo, and as soon as they got there, the Americans launched an all-night bombing campaign on the city. But once again, Joseph narrowly survives. A recurring theme of Joseph's story is that he is repeatedly almost killed by his own teammates. For the next few days, Joseph was interrogated 20 to 24 hours a day, but he didn't give them any information, and he repeatedly called them sons of bitches until they got so fed up with him they just beat him to a pulp, and he was knocked unconscious and kept in the hospital for several days. For the next 3 months, Joseph was starved, beaten, interrogated some more, and moved to multiple POW camps. He'd be forced to do back-breaking labor all day. At night, he would survive Allied bombing runs, and he would constantly weather hunger, disease, and exhaustion. At one point, he was locked inside of this boxcar with 50 other guys. He could barely move inside of it, and once again, it was strafed by Allied planes, and he was one of the very few people to survive that. In September of 1944, Joseph was moved to a Russian POW camp in Poland that held about 12,000 Russian men and women POWs. And as soon as he got there, he immediately began planning his escape. 2 months later, on a freezing night in November, Joseph, along with 3 other American POWs, managed to cut the barbed wire and snuck out of the camp and began making their escape south. They snuck into a railway station and hopped on a train car they believed was headed for Poland. Their plan was to meet up with the Soviet Red Army as it pushed through the region. But unfortunately, they got on the wrong train and they wound up in Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. One thing you don't hear much about when it comes to World War II is there was actually a large number of Germans that hated Hitler and totally disagreed with the Nazis, and so they organized a German underground resistance that was designed to help the Allies during the war. And so when Joseph and the other 3 American POWs arrived in Berlin, still wearing their POW uniforms, a member of the German resistance saw them and immediately grabbed them and brought them into hiding. But after only a week, the infamous Nazi secret police, aka the Gestapo, discovered them and arrested them. Over the next 10 days, Joseph and the other American POWs got to see firsthand just how awful the Gestapo really were. They were constantly interrogated while they were beaten, kicked, walked on, strung up by their arms backwards. They were hit with whips, clubs, and rifle butts until they drifted into unconsciousness. And then as soon as they started to come to, it would start all over again. After those 10 days, the Gestapo turned Joseph and the other 3 American POWs over to the German army, who put them in the brutal prison camp called the Stalag Luft III. Upon arrival, Joseph was immediately sentenced to 30 days inside of a 4 by 5 foot pine box that was too small to stand up or lay down in. Fortunately for him, he only had to endure 7 days because a Red Cross operative from Geneva intervened on his behalf. It would take months for Joseph to get his strength back after being inside of this box, but as soon as he did, he began plotting his next escape. One night, Joseph, along with his 3 American POW buddies, managed to break through a prison wall and made a mad dash for freedom, but the Nazi prison guards saw it and opened fire on them. All 3 of Joseph's friends were killed as they ran, but Joseph got away, only to hear the faint barking of the German shepherds the Nazis had sent to hunt him down. So in the freezing cold of Poland in January, Joseph leapt headfirst into a partially frozen river and swam over 2 miles down it before getting out and running blindly into the woods. Somehow, miraculously, he managed to reach Soviet lines before he froze to death. And there, he spoke with battalion commander Alexandra Samasenko, a woman who holds the distinction of being the only female tank commander in all of World War II. Even though Joseph spoke very little Russian, he convinced her to let him join her unit. And so she gave him a gun and some ammunition, and she told him what their next objective was. They were going to liberate the same POW camp he had just escaped from. And so Joseph, alongside the Soviet Red Army that he now fought for, turn around and go smash this POW camp. And after the dust had settled, Joseph raided the main camp office and stole his defiant official POW photo that the Germans had taken of him on the first day he got captured. Joseph continued to fight alongside the Soviets across the Eastern Front for a couple of months, but when a German dive bomber blew up the tank that Joseph was riding on, he was evacuated to a Russian field hospital. There, he received a visit from Georgy Zhukov, the most important Soviet military commander in World War II, who was intrigued by the only non-Soviet in the hospital. He sat with Joseph and learned his story through an interpreter, and then afterwards he provided Joseph with official paperwork that would allow him to rejoin American forces. And so in February of 1945, Joseph was sent to the US Embassy in Moscow, but unfortunately, when he finally met a friendly American face, after nearly a year of fighting behind enemy lines, they didn't believe his story. They told him that Joseph R. Byerly had been killed in action on June 10, 1944, and that they had already had a funeral mass in his honor in Muskegon, and that his obituary had already been printed in the paper. But despite Joseph painstakingly going through his story over and over again, the ambassador just could not believe what he was hearing. And so worried Joseph might actually be a well-trained German spy, the ambassador sent him to Odessa to have his credentials verified. But Odessa had the same problem and couldn't verify him, so they sent him to Egypt. Egypt had the same problem, and they too could not verify his credentials. And so they sent him to Italy, where they finally used fingerprints, and they confirmed that yes, this is in fact Joseph R. Byerly. And so on April 11th, 1945, Joseph returned home, and needless to say, his parents were very surprised to see him because they were convinced he died 10 months earlier. 1 year later, Joseph would actually get married in the same church that held his funeral mass when everybody believed he was dead. Joseph was given the Purple Heart, and then in the 1990s was given additional presidential awards from US President Bill Clinton as well as the Russian President Boris Yeltsin. Joseph was also given a custom-made AK-47 from the guy who invented the AK-47. Joseph died in 2004 at the age of 81, and his son would go on to become the US ambassador to Russia under George W. Bush and Barack Obama. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please replace all of the Amazon Music follow buttons Windex with olive oil. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation